do I introduce myself?
I can introduce you.
That's fine.
Okay. So everybody, welcome to Dragon Tail Books. I'm Ann Vogel, and we have retired Captain Tim Tyre, and he is going to talk about his book and the research he did on his family to write the book. And so this is the start of our Writing Genealogy and History series. So we'll have other authors come in and explain the research they did for their books as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking me to do this. My wife is sitting back in the corner. Her name is Marilyn. She had significant play in this, so I have to recognize her.
Okay.
So, yeah, this is a love story which weaves through the Second World War, the preparation of an aviator and his high school sweetheart who stayed at home and communicated with my dad by letters. The letters went back and forth. He lived to age 97 years. She lived to age 94 years. So in his early 80s, when I was still a naval officer full-time, he asked me about writing a book about, he asked about writing a book together, which meant that I would write the book. I was pretty busy at the time, and I said, I don't know, that sounds like a daunting thing to do, and but ultimately, the idea, you know, he planted the seed, and it grew a bit, and so I'm going to walk you through the elements of the book, and then I'll kind of tell the story about what it was like to write the book and how I crafted it and the stages I went through. So it takes place in the late 30s, early 40s, right before the war. They were in high school together in Maywood, Illinois. And he was trained as a Army Air Corps aviator. At that time, they both graduated from high school the same year, and at that time you could not be commissioned as an officer in the military unless you had a college degree or some college. So what they did with gentlemen that passed all the tests was they sent them to college for about half a year. So that was his first engagement after he got out of basic training, was to go to Centenary College down in Louisiana. And then he was a college guy, of course. Then they could commission him as an officer if he got through flight training. Let me just forward this to the next slide.
So we're all pilots, officers?
Yeah, you cannot be a pilot in any of the military branches unless you're an officer. Yeah. Proof that you score low on the test. So these aircraft were what he was trained in. That is a PT, primary trainer, PT, 19. Now I flew a plane like that. I'm also an aviator, and we have a plane like that at the Commemorative Air Force in Waukesha, Wisconsin. It's a PT-26, which is the same thing except it's got a cockpit. And speaking as a pilot, aviator, flight instructor, it's a very forgiving plane to fly. So he went through his basic training and primary flight training, and that was the first aircraft he flew that had a 6-cylinder engine in it that was started with a crank in order to energize the magnetos. And they jump in. His instructor sat behind him, and he sat up in front. They didn't have radios in those aircraft, so they would communicate with a tube where the instructor would yell at him if he did something wrong. And if he did a lot of things wrong, the instructor would move the stick that you control the aircraft with back and forth, which would snap between his knees to get his attention. once he basically mastered the ability to take an aircraft off and land it and not leave parts on the ground, they moved them into a much more sophisticated aircraft, which at that time was called a Vultese, Vultess, Vultese 13. There you see them. You see hundreds of these all across the country, even these days at air shows. They are advanced trainers, or AT6s. So that's also a six-cylinder engine, but it's much more of a advanced, rather sophisticated aircraft. And once he got through that phase of training, so this is probably 4 months of training, this is another 4 or 5 months of training, they were taught how to do formation flying. And when they got through that phase, and examinations and competitive things that were going on to weed out who was going to go where, the pilots would then make a choice about whether they were going to fly in fighters or bombers. And he elected to fly that warship. That is a Martin Marauder B-26 twin engine, probably the most sophisticated bomber that we had in World War II. It was so fast that older vintage fighters couldn't keep up with it. Mm-hmm. The plane would do about 280 knots. It was a revolutionary plane in its design, and it was one of the first aircraft that was introduced into the fleet without going through several years of testing. It was designed, manufactured, and put right into the squadrons. When it was originally designed, it had a crew of 5. It was designed for low-level combat support. So it was designed to be flown at about 2,000 or 3,000 feet above the ground and be highly maneuverable. And to make it that fast and that maneuverable, it had very short wings. The wings of an airplane have some to do with the speeds that it requires to be able to take off and stall.
Because that's the lift, right?
Yeah, the wings are the primary source of lift. So the wings on this aircraft were short, so that its, we call rotation speed in an airplane, the speed at which it would begin to lift off the ground, which was probably around 110 knots, or about 115 miles an hour, was within 4 or 5 miles per hour of the speed at which it would stall if you got slower than that. Hmm. And as a result, there were many, many training accidents with this airplane. It was a very, very difficult airplane to fly. There was a common phrase used back then, 1 a day in Tampa Bay. So they did some of the training down in Florida, and they lost a lot of pilots in training. Yeah. Okay. So the Department of War at that time said, well, we should just scrap the plane. And Billy Mitchell, a very famous aviator, Mitchell Field in Milwaukee, was probably the best aviator the Army Air Force had. He went down and demonstrated that that plane could be flown if people were trained properly to fly it. So they did 2 things. They changed the training protocols, and they lengthened the wings, and decided really it's a better aircraft to be used at medium heights for bombing. So then it was reconfigured to be used at altitudes of about 10,000 feet, which is just short of where you need oxygen. So this, although they could equip them with oxygen, did not have oxygen. So most of his bombing raids, he was in the European theater, were at approximately 10,000 feet, 8 to 10,000 feet. Once that change was made, they stopped having accidents in the aircraft. And this particular aircraft had the lowest attrition rate of any of the aircraft during World War II. Many of them were shot down by the enemy, but in terms of the performance of the aircraft itself, it was really a gem. It was quite a plane. And the book details some of the design features of this airplane. One interesting design feature: the guns that were shooting .50 caliber ammunition had long belts of ammunition. 20 and 30 feet long. They were fed on a conveyor belt that was designed by the Lionel Train Company in this country. And it was the first plane that had that kind of a system to feed the information into the ball turrets and the guns in the wings and the nose, etc. A lot of revolutionary things about the airplane. First, fully aerodynamic fuselage. Just a sweet plane to fly. So my dad loved this plane. He took one look at it and said, that's what I want to do. So then he went on to advanced training for bomber squadron flights in Texas, and made dear friends that he was friends with throughout his life that I knew as a kid. They were like uncles. And then he was ready to be shipped off. So in the meantime, while all this was happening down south, where they have forgiving weather so they can fly all the time, my mother was back in Maywood. She had enrolled in Rosary College, and was involved with many of the organizations back then during the war where women who stayed at home could do things to support the fellows overseas. So she was in groups where they made bandages and things of that type. And they started corresponding. And so we had boxes and boxes of letters, just like you mentioned that you had. 1,300 of them, actually. And so part of what I drew upon when I wrote the book were those letters. So how do you write a book if you're busy doing a lot of other things? I had not written a book before. I have a lot of academic training, so I'd done research, but I'd never really done writing a book. Didn't know how to do it. So I'll come to the methodology here in a minute to put the audience into the context of where we are. So this is Pearl Harbor. I'll come back to why that was important in a personal way to me in a little while. So there's Uncle Sam. There's Ike right before the D-Day invasions, talking with the guys going across. My wife and I spent about a week over in the beaches of Normandy here several months ago. Moving experience. I would invite any U.S. citizen to go over there and see what was done. It's just amazing what we did. And at that time, the United States had an isolationist kind of a mentality. We didn't want to get involved in anything in Europe. We were not interested in wars in Europe. We had been through the First World War and lost a lot of people. And then we'd been through the Depression, and the country was trying to recover, and it kind of wanted to be just left alone. So there was a definite sort of, we don't want to get involved. Were you going to say something?
And I got 2 messages from people who would like to be part of the Zoom. And I don't know how to tell them to do that.
So they can go to dragontailbooks.store.
Okay.
And they click on, there's an event, okay, down at the bottom, and then it has the Zoom link there.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No problem.
No, that's good.
So we were back at the United States and the climate of the country at the time, in the late 30s and 40s, which was we don't want to be involved in anything in Europe. Okay. Until Pearl Harbor. So it all changed. And my dad was the sort of fellow that was, this is an honor to do, I got to go do it. And so he went, and his brothers went, and most of the people he knew went. In fact, he used to explain to me that at that time, if you didn't go, it was frowned upon. So the country came together quickly when we were under attack. A little bit like after 9/11, for what was it, about 3 days. And then we all started arguing with one another again, like we do in this country. So that's the era. But again, I'll come back to the Pearl Harbor event. So that's my mother and dad after the war. Her dad, who was a World War I doughboy over in France, discouraged her from getting married. engaged before he left and wanted to get married, but he said, no, having been in war myself, let's make sure he comes back and then you get married, or at least comes back in one piece and then you get married. But this was after the war, and that was their marriage photograph. And the book details how the marriage ceremony went and some of the interesting features of that as well. I'll get into some of that as well. So there they are. That's Shirley, known as Scotty. She's a Scot. I'm a Scot on my mom's side. And that's my dad, Ed. At that time, he was a first lieutenant in the Army Air Corps. So that's 3 ranks up in the officer chain. So why did I write the book? This is contained in the book itself. I've editorialized it a bit for purposes of this briefing, but what it says is I wrote the book because I love and respect my parents. I wrote the book because my dad has always been a hero to me. He was one of those guys, when I was growing up, there wasn't anything he couldn't do. He's just one of those kind of people. So I grew up in a small town with small town values, immediate post-World War II era. Families back then were very large, so there were 7 kids in our family. I was the oldest of all 7 kids. And I was blessed with parents who worked their tails off and encouraged us academically and athletically in every way. We were encouraged to achieve and do well. Some of the earliest recollections I have of my dad was after the war, his returning, he stayed in the reserve component and flew in the reserves. And I have recollections of him coming off the flight line in a flight suit and a flight bag and grinning. He was happy when he was flying airplanes. He was a very humble guy, quiet, didn't draw a lot of attention to himself at all. Kind of classic World War II generation. As I grew older, what he did started to mean something to me. And in particular, what they went through as a young engaged couple during the war era. When I myself was commissioned as an officer in the United States Navy, for which he said, what are you going in the Navy for? Why aren't you going in the Air Force? They were very proud of what I was doing. We were married, we had a couple of kids, and it was just time. So when I got into the military service, I developed a deeper understanding of what he had done. You don't really understand about such things unless you get into the military community. It's a different world, it's a different culture. So the respect for what he did got deeper. And after completing my own flight training many years ago, the first guy I took for a ride was my dad. And when I was busy, there were a lot of things to take care of in an airplane when you're flying, and I was busy doing things, and I glanced over at him, and he was all teared up. You know. Special moment. So when I was still in the Navy, I was commanding officer of a unit at the Pentagon, and I was there on 9/11. And the first guy that got a hold of me was my dad on the phone. When the phones came back up, the phones went down for about 5 hours. So the first call I get is my dad, and it was classic dad, very short. Are you okay? This is your Pearl Harbor. Go work this thing. And so then, after all that surreal business stopped and things quieted a bit, then I knew I just had to write the book. And the book really kind of wrote itself. So this is how I organized the task. I did oral interviews with my parents. I was blessed to have them both alive then in their 80s, and it was an absolute hoot to do oral interviews with my parents. The first mistake I made was to say, I'll come over and talk to you together.
Oh, no.
No,
No.
that didn't work at all. So what happened there was my mother talked and my dad said nothing. And she would talk and talk as if she'd been an aviator herself. And she was never an aviator. In fact, the only person she ever flew with in a plane was me. She never flew with my dad, but she flew with me. So I said, okay, for the oral interviews, on Tuesday I'll come and talk to you, Mom, and on Thursdays I'll come and talk to you, Dad, and separate them. That's how we did that. And the oral interviews, I asked them really just to take me back to 1939, 1940, 41. What was it like? Where did you meet? Where'd you go to school? So the story also has a thread as he's being trained as an aviator, which is described, and the history of World War II, which is briefly described in the book as a thread. The other thread was the two of them falling in love with each other. So there's descriptions back and forth in each chapter about how this relationship evolved. And then I had the letters. And there were so many of them, and they weren't really well organized. They were in shoe boxes and all over the place. You know, and they weren't chronologic, so I just started going through them, and I found just wonderful letters, and some of them I used in the book. So my dad was always sort of an amateur artist, and he sent a letter when he was in his first phase of basic training to her with little like comic images of what it was like when he would try and land a plane. When you first train a pilot to land a plane, the speeds with which you land are very important. If you come in too fast, the plane doesn't want to stop flying, so it touches the ground and then lifts off again and touches the ground, and it kind of bounces down the runway until the speed energy drains off. So he made a comic strip sort of about the way he lands the plane, which is a bunch of bounces, and then the way the plane is supposed to be landed. That was one I put in the book. They're very poignant letters between the two of them. Particularly as the war went on, he flew 50 combat missions. And at about number 30 or so, those guys started thinking, the odds are not getting good here. And so the tenor of the letters changed a little. So that was also included, a couple of those. So the format of the book that I chose was to really have three parallel threads occurring at the same time: the relationship, the war, and the training of an aviator, which was a special fun for me. I'm a flight instructor. I love flying airplanes. It was a neat thing to describe to people. What's it like to fly an airplane? Learn how to fly an airplane, particularly a warship, which is lickety-split, the difficult thing to do. I was 22 years a naval officer, so when you have a full career, one of the things that's expected about halfway through the career is to spend a year and do coursework or actually go to the Naval War College. I couldn't do that, so I did a lot of coursework, and I chose World War II because it was sort of part of the family tradition and a particular interest of mine. So I know World War II. I knew the history of World War II. So that helped to know that and to appreciate what was happening for us to deal with the juggernaut of the Nazis and the fact that they'd basically taken over almost all of Europe and about half of North Africa. And, it was really, had we not gotten into this thing, we'd be speaking a different language here tonight, wouldn't we? Yeah. So that helped, was knowing about the history of the war. I was delighted to find that the Department of Defense has got archival resources for authors doing books, particularly somebody who's ex-military. They're real forgiving to help you to get at things. And that included going out to the Air Museum at Montham-Davis Air Base in Arizona, near Tucson. They have the only, it's in parts, but the only fully complete B-26. They're putting it back together again. There are no B-26s flying anymore. There's none of them. There's one of them at the Smithsonian in DC, and there is a fully intact B-26 over in France, in Normandy, as a matter of fact, in a museum, which we went to when we went to the beaches in Normandy. But anyway, they have the most complete archival research library at that air museum in Tucson. And they were very gracious about just, grab whatever you need. And so there was a lot of support with getting references and specific information. It was of particular interest to me as a flyer myself. How long did it take to write the thing? Probably a year and a half. I'd work at it for a while and then just sort of get busy with other things and then come back to it. But it kept, again, like I said, once I got into it, it almost kind of wrote itself. It's like most things in life, you get started on it, then you have a need to finish it up, if you're OCD like I am. I dedicated the book to my wife. She's a one of a kind, very patient, very quietly encouraging person who's been a buddy for more than 55 years. We've been married. And without the kind of person she was, none of the other things would have fallen in place. Aviation training, military, all the kids. We have 4 kids that are great kids, and 6 grandkids, and she's just the center of gravity for the whole thing. So, in particular, when my parents got very aged, they needed a lot of care, and she was there for that whole thing. Just never complained one bit. So she's just a super lady. And then to my kids and our grandkids, it's really our legacy. It's a story about where they came from, and it really does speak to that generation of people who were selfless. Not so much of that these days. Values are a touch different, or they appear to be. I don't know. I didn't find that to be the case in the military myself. I had command of several units, and the folks that I had in those units were just crackerjack people. They would do anything for you. So, and then my folks were married for 70 plus years. They loved each other. So that's how and the reason why I dedicated the book to my wife and family. 2 quick stories, and then I'll take questions. After I finished the book and it got published and all that, I kind of thought, well, you're an author. So in the great tradition of the way my wife does business, she said, well, you're really not an author, you're more like a chronicler. Which is absolutely true. It was hilarious, and good for her. And the other is a very personal thing I'll just tell you about, and that's this. I don't think there's anything else I could have done to look after my folks after I did this. A lot of people, when you lose your folks, gee, I wish I would have spent more time or done this or done that or whatever. The 2 of them each had a copy of the book by them all the time, even when they were in hospice. So it was a good thing to do. I'm glad I did. It was worth all the time and effort and all the energy to get it completed. So I brought along a couple of artifacts. This is a Martin Marauder B-26, twin engine, 1,200 horsepower Wasp radial engines. Like I said, it would do about 280 knots. Very, very, very capable ship for what it was designed to do. That's a photograph of my folks when they got married. This is what they looked like about 60 years after they got married. And this is a picture of my dad in 1942 when he was 19 years old. Wow. As a cadet in an Army Air Corps training down at Bonham Field in Bonham, Texas.
He looks like such a kid.
Yeah,
At
well,
that point, I mean, he was, but
well, he was a kid, yeah.
he just looks
He was
so
flying
young.
combat missions when he was 19 years old,
Yes.
I mean, ay.
So how did he keep all his letters, or did he send them home? Like, how did you have?
Well, the
so
letters
many?
went back and forth, and
Right.
they each kept them,
Okay.
and they basically kept them in boxes in their closet. And in fact, one of the homes they lived in, there had been a water leak, and it got into one of the closets, and some of the letters got, full of water, and that was like, oh, here's all these letters. Oh my God.
But how did he keep them, like, while he was?
Well, when he was over there,
Yeah.
well, I'm sure he didn't keep all of them.
Okay.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I'm sure he didn't keep all of them.
I think it would be hard to, because if you're going different places, you don't have a lot of storage
Yeah.
space.
Yeah.
But 1,300.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
Yeah, well, one of my younger brothers, Chris, who, he and his wife took all of those 1,300 letters and digitized them and had them on thumb drives, and they passed them out at Christmas to everybody in the family. So now we have them in a format that's accessible, and they won't be lost because they're getting old. Yeah,
Did they organize them chronologically when they
I
scanned them
haven't, I haven't
in? Looked.
energized the thumb drive yet. I've been done with this for a while. I want to be done with it.
And so what kind of questions did you ask when you did the interviews?
Well, what was it like to date each other? They lived about 6 miles away from one another in Elmwood Park, near Oak Park, in Maywood. And at that time, if you hiked it, it was 6 miles. You otherwise could take a bus.
Mhm.
And so there were bus rides. And they went to the same high school, Proviso East High School, so they saw each other in high school. My dad claims that the first time he really got a look at my mom, that was it. He was just in love. And he was, like I said, sort of soft-spoken. My mother was very articulate and was very good at subjects like English. So my dad claimed that he had trouble with those subjects, and so she would help him, which I found out later was a tactic.
So he said he needed a tutor.
He said he needed help. Yeah, he was a pretty sharp cookie himself. There's another thing I talk about in the book, which is sort of an little human interest feature. My mother was a Catholic, very Catholic family, and that meant that my dad was invited to convert to Catholicism, which is kind of the way it works with Catholics, right? Mm-hmm. So he was raised as a Christian Scientist.
It's a little contrast.
Sort of a, but I don't know how serious they were involved in their faith beliefs. It was just kind of the tradition he grew up in. Anyway, he converted to Catholicism, which very much annoyed his mother. And so she expressed her dismay with that by wearing black to the wedding.
Oh.
That kind of, funny stuff.
Yeah.
That'll teach you.
Yeah. So,
when you did these 3 different threads,
yeah.
Was there any thread that was harder than the other thread to put together?
I don't think so. I knew the history pretty well. I knew what was going on in Europe, and I knew in particular what a dreadful thing was going on in the South Pacific. And when they declared victory in Europe, the aviators were pushed out to the West Coast and put in kind of holding tanks, so to speak, because they were going to move them all over to the Pacific Theater. And the B-26 had big play in the Pacific Theater. And when I got to that part of the story and I knew what was going to happen, and it not ended with bomb, his chances would have gone way up for not coming home. So glad that ended the way it did, although it was terrible business. He wanted to keep flying when he got finished with the war, so he got into the reserve component and flew until he was in his 50s. And he flew something called flying boxcar, which were used over in Germany when the Soviets grabbed Berlin and wouldn't let people in. Remember the airlift to support the Germans? His squadron was called, but his commanding officer wouldn't let him go because he had too many kids at that point. He said, "No, you're not going. You've already done 50 combat missions. You're not going." He flew a C-47, which is a classic transport plane, tail dragger plane. So it doesn't land. This one has tricycle gear, kind of nose wheel and main gear. Tail dragger, it doesn't have a nose wheel. It's got a wheel at the end. So a C-47 is kind of a troop transport plane. When you look at the photographs and images that come from the invasions of Normandy, and you see the big planes that they all parachute out of, those are C-47s. He flew those too. Twin engine.
Why did you choose of those, how many, I don't remember how many, 1,300. Of those 1,300, did you read all of them? And how did you choose which ones?
Yeah, I didn't read all of them, no, for sure I didn't. Partly it was the spot in the book I was at. If I saw a letter that fit, it was perfect. And so, for example, the one that has this real funny little comic strip-like thing that he drew, I was at the point in the book where I was talking about his being trained in primary training. So when you're first learning how to fly airplanes, you're in very simple planes that are pretty easy to fly. And there was this one. It was a perfect example of what was going on. Because that happens. I mean, when I've taught quite a number of students to fly airplanes, and same thing happens these days too. They come in too fast. You have to pay close attention to what we call B speeds. There's so many things going on, they don't pay attention to that. So they bounce. It's not the end of the world, but it's funny. Yeah, I'll you don't break anything.
Yeah.
My mother passed before my dad. She had a little bit of dementia and was having a rough go. And I would go over and visit her, and I'd read out of the book to her. And it would quiet her down. So you could see her go back to 1944, 43. It was calming for her to
So
see.
it was long-term memory and felt familiar to
Yeah,
her.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and it was, a very
Yeah.
happy, loving time in her life. So.
Is there any passage you'd like to share that you're very, that's your favorite, or like something you want to share from the book itself at all?
About 10 years ago, my dad was awarded the French Legion of Honor Medal, which is the equivalent of our Legion of our Congressional Medal of Honor. And when that happened, he was knighted. So the French ambassador, his representative, came up to Madison. We had a big ceremony in Madison at the governor's mansion. And he wanted to give a speech, which amazed everybody. And he did. And I don't think I can read it without getting all choked up, but it's in the book. That was an interesting ceremony because we had 3 generations of family there and lots of friends. And the Air Force Air Guard contingent in Wisconsin was just all over themselves wanting to meet this guy and talk to him. So they were there. The adjutant general for the state of Wisconsin at that time was a fellow by the name of General Dunbar. And he was also an aviator, and so he was there, and we spoke quite a bit. And he invited a fellow that I got a hold of organization in Milwaukee that teaches people to speak French. And there are iterations of that organization all over the country. And they said, I was looking for somebody we could have come to the ceremony that had been in France during the war. And the woman that ran that organization, very gracious person, said, well, there's a retired professor from the University of Wisconsin-Madison who's very good speaker, and he was in France during the years of occupation with the Nazis. You should get a hold of him. So I did, and he came and gave a very moving speech at this ceremony about what it was like to be a kid in an occupied country where the Nazis would take the young people and ship them over to Germany to do hard labor, and they took the food from the people, and they lost their freedom. So that whole ceremony was kind of a moving thing too. Yeah. And there's pictures in the book of that ceremony where he got. I didn't bring the medal along tonight, but it's a beautiful medal and a big plaque.
Did he fly out of England or where?
When he first got over there, he flew off the island of Corsica in the Med, and his first 15 missions or so were up the spine of Italy, north. At that time, the Germans had occupied Italy. This is before Anzio, and then a little bit after Anzio. And there's a pass up there called the Brenner Pass. So you fly northbound right up through the spine of Italy. There's mountains on both sides. The Germans had gun emplacements in the mountains shooting across at about 10,000 feet, which is the altitude that these planes flew at. So there'd be a squadron of these guys going up to bomb the railroads that were bringing the Germans down into Italy, and they had ACAC, all the way there and all the way back. I remember him telling me about that the first time we talked about that. He said, the first time, Tim, I saw those things, it was really kind of beautiful. There were these puffs of white until you got into it. And then it would scare the hell out of you because this stuff would come right through the skin of the airplane, these hot fragments of metal. And I remember one of his missions, he described, I think it might have been his co-pilot or maybe the radio operator, I forget who, but anyway, one piece of metal came through and it cut one of the hydraulic lines. Hydraulic fluid is pink-red. So there was red all over the sky, and he said, I've been hit, and he wasn't hit, it was just the hydraulic. He came back from one mission where they landed, and they would inspect the plane after they taxied off the runways, and he said there was a hole in the propeller, one of the blades of the propeller, big enough to put his fist through, and the propeller didn't come apart. Yeah.
Somebody did a really nice job of making it then.
They were well made.
I mean,
They were extremely well made. These aircraft were hardy. When victory in Europe was declared, there was a big celebration. In answer to your question, he was first in Corsica for about the first 15 missions. Then he moved to Dijon, France. And they took over a base that had been previously run by the Germans, an air base. And that's where he finished up the remaining 25 missions, 35 missions, whatever it was, to get to 50. Anyway, when victory in Europe was declared, they had a victory celebration in Dijon. The Europeans were beside themselves, happy to have all this over with. And so the squadron he was with decided to do a victory pass over the town at very low altitude. And they asked him, because he'd had so many missions and very successful missions, to be the lead pilot in this wing of about 20 aircraft. So they all took off and formed up, and they got in these lines of wings that were coming. And his starboard engine, or the right side engine, started to make big explosion sounds and then caught on fire.
oh jeez.
So he feathered the prop and turned the engine off and had to make a one-engine landing, which is a pretty tricky thing to do in a plane like that, and managed to do it without dying.
Mhm.
And got out of the plane, and he said, my knees would not stop knocking for about a half hour. They were just like, well, yeah. What had happened in that episode is that one of the gas lines going into one of the cylinders had worked its way loose, so it was spitting raw gas out of the engine, which is what caught it on fire and made the explosions occur and all that stuff. But he did what he was trained to do. I mean, pilots are trained to do these things, to know what to do when it happens. But that was a close call.
So are you going to write your own story, or do you have something else you're interested in writing about to leave for your family?
Good question. I don't know. I've done a lot of wacky things and managed to walk away.
Still here to tell about it.
Still here to tell about it, yeah. At the end of my Navy career, I was sort of pipelined to be an admiral. And it would have meant another couple of years and unaccompanied over in Qatar.
Mm.
In the Mideast, we were going to stand up a Homeland Security forward base in Qatar. And so I told the Chief of Naval Operations, because I was at the Pentagon, he and I knew each other. And I came back and said, I think I'm not going to do this. He was unhappy. And he said, well, okay, fine. But I'm going to retain you, which means I can get you for a year. I said, okay, if you need something, give me a call. So sure enough, I get a call. And I got involved in a capital murder case, which was very, very interesting as an expert witness. So in another part of my life, I was a shrink. And that was an interesting experience to go through. Actually, there were two of them. I did one, and they said, the guy knows his business, so they had me do another one. And so I was recalled to duty to do those things. And that could be a book, because it was a fascinating experience to see what this country does to save a life, and the levels of appeal and how all that works in the Uniform Code of Military Justice was a pretty interesting experience. So, in the back of my mind, that would be an interesting book to write about. Otherwise, I don't know. We're busy getting used to Menominee. We've been up here a couple of years, from 40 years down to Waukesha, so we're trying to meet people, do stuff, play some golf, fly airplanes,
Maybe one of your children will come and interview you two.
Well, I think that's a fine idea.
Looks like maybe some are online.
Maybe they are. We'll see.
It would be fun things, like I'm just thinking, like, okay, what would I ask my dad? Because I'm sure he has lots to tell. He always tells about when he went to India for 7 weeks, 8 weeks, I think. And he always tells, when I was in India, lots of stories, because it really meant a lot to him.
Yeah.
I told him he should write all those stories down.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Well, I think when you're in the military and you're sent different places, one of the things you learn is how well America works compared to other places in the world.
Mm.
For sure, that's a impression I carry with me. We've got it figured out here, mostly. I mean, we're always poking at each other, but as a way of life, we have it figured out. And there are many places in the world that just do not work.
Mm.
And you wouldn't want to be stuck there if you needed something. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One of your children is on. Well, I think a couple might be online.
Oh, no.
So she said, I'm one of his children. And I said, you'll need to start interviewing them.
Oh. Well, it's okay to write a book if you want. But talk to mom first. Okay, have we run out of, is the briefing over?
Anyone else have a question?
I think it's very interesting. You think overall it was a positive experience? Was there any difficult part when you were writing?
No, just, I mean, it takes some effort to do something like this.
Mhm.
So there was that. But no, and when I look back on it, I'm just very happy I did it.
Mhm.
Because as I said, it gives you it gives me a sense of closure in terms of my parents. I don't think that there wasn't anything that I didn't do to look after them,
Mhm.
Particularly what this book seemed to mean to them, I mean, it was their story. So,
Mhm.
yeah. No, I don't think I have any regrets about doing the book at all. I do active flight instruction, so I teach ground schools and teach people to fly airplanes even at this advanced age. And periodically I'll have a student that finds out that I wrote a book, or they go read the book and go, "Did you write this thing? This is really pretty interesting stuff about how people learn how to fly airplanes." So I interweave this a little bit with what I do with students. I remember when my dad was still alive, if I would teach an advanced ground school, so advanced ratings, like instrument ratings and stuff like that, or high altitude things, I would usually say to this group after weeks of like, "Oh, yeah, this is hard stuff," I'd say, "Hey, listen, I got a guy I know that was a combat pilot. Would you like to spend an evening and just have him come over instead of listening to all this stuff about mechanical systems and the avionics on the plane?" "Oh, yeah. And I didn't tell him who it was. And so my dad had come over, and this fellow that was kind of not particularly talkative would just, you couldn't shut him up. I mean, and I would hear things then that I had never heard before. It was a riot. I remember one of those distinctly. He was talking about the B-26 and what it was like to fly it, and blah blah blah. And he gets finished with that, and one of the fellows in the audience puts his hands up and says, "Well, did you know Lindbergh?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, he was our next door neighbor." "Well, I never knew that." And he was. He lived right across the street from,
Wow.
Charles Lindbergh.
Hey, Chuck.
Yeah. When he was a little kid, my dad was a little kid, Lindbergh lived there, and Lindbergh, he explained, would on Halloween throw pennies out the front yard. And all the kids in the neighborhood would run over and pick up the pennies. And so then, this whole group of aviation students like, "Oh, that's pretty interesting. Wow, you met Lindbergh. And is that why you became an aviator?" And he went, "No." That was my dad.
Just a side note.
So there's a question. What was an unexpected thing you learned about your parents through this process, particularly your mother?
Hmm.
And is it Kateri or is it?
It might be Kateri.
Is that how you pronounce it, or is it?
Yeah,
Okay.
Kateri.
It's my middle name, so
Oh,
but I've
really?
heard it pronounced different ways.
Yeah, it's Kateri Tekakwitha, right?
Mhm,
Yeah. Well, I learned she was tough as nails, for sure. To, raise up all the kids and get through worrying about him and all that stuff. Yeah, she was tough. My mother was a tough lady. And would not quit when she got her teeth into something. Yeah, so you didn't want to mess with her. Yeah. She had a big influence on encouraging people to do well in school, me in particular. Yeah. I miss my folks.
At least you have something now. Yeah, like this, the whole
Yep.
family has that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for listening, and thanks for asking me to come and do this.
Well, thank you so much.
Very
Yes,
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so our next talk is February 20th, and it's Dr. Jo Navarre. She did some research at the Bodleian and various libraries about divination. So it's kind of writing history. So she's going to talk about her adventures in research.
Isn't divination finding water?
She's focused on palmistry.
Oh, palmistry.
But
Yeah.
that's
Oh,
that's the other
yes.
version of divination is getting two rods and
yeah.
having them cross and go.
Yeah.
There's water down
Willow
there.
branches, yeah.
Yes.
My wife has a relative that did that.
But she said, great job. I learned even more from this talk. So
Oh, Terry said that?
yeah, and
That's a compliment from
I
Terry.
will post the recording too. So if you
All right,
missed, I think some of you online came a little late.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much.
Well, thank
Thank
you.
you.
This is wonderful.
I was looking and I found